Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm so excited to say this to the season finale of UXR Conversations Season 1. That's it. We've reached that point. It's been an incredible couple of months for me personally to get to have such meaningful and insightful conversations with countless talented, inspiring peers in the UX research community. I'm really grateful for the experience. Obviously, these are strange times right now, but I'm at least thankful that something incredible came out of this. And hopefully you've been enjoying other UXR conversations and joining us. And thank you for joining today or later on if you're watching this recorded. By the way, season 2 of UXR Conversations will be coming later on in the summer. I'm very excited about that as well. And as always, if you want to join me for a conversation about anything to do with UX research or even UX more broadly, I'd love to hear from you. And today, if you've been pondering about research democratization or undemocratization and the role that we should have as researchers and the role that everyone else should have, all non-researchers, in companies we work for, this is the episode for you. So stick with us. This notion of democratizing research has been around for a while. I think we'll get into that. I even had a previous UXR conversation with Behzod Sirjani about research democratization. I think that was episode number 3, if I'm not mistaken. And then Uber's Eduardo Gomez Ruiz wrote an incredible Medium article about kind of scaling UX research and training an army of non-researchers. And then my esteemed guest today wrote just an incredibly thought-provoking, eye-opening, in my opinion, courageous article titled Undemocratizing User Research. And Saswati, who's with us today, just challenged this entire approach. So today I'm delighted to host Saswati Saha Mitra for UXR Conversation, and I can't wait to see where it takes us. Welcome, Saswati. Good to see you.
Well, thank you, Norm, for having me here, and hopefully, we're going to continue some of that discussion right now.
Absolutely. I'm super excited for it. So before we jump into things, just a few logistics. In case this is your first UXR conversation, so again, I'm Noam Siegel. I'm Director of User Research at Wealthfront when I'm not doing this and parenting and all of the other things we do in life. This is today's topic. And Saswati is currently a part of the research leadership at WhatsApp. We'll get to your journey in a second. As always, if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear from you. Simply comment on YouTube and we'll see that up on our screens and we'll chat. So we'd love to take your questions. And if you want to watch more of these conversations and more content just in general, then this is where my YouTube channel is at, and I invite you to subscribe. Saswati, can you maybe start by, I always like to ask people about their journeys. Every researcher I've met has a fascinating journey into research, and across your career, you have accomplished a lot of really inspiring things. Can you share just a quick review of what you've been through in your career so far?
So I started just my studies, like my sort of formal professional career as a student and then a professor of English literature. And I was teaching at one point in India courses like journalism, mass communication. And at the same time, because, at that time, tenure was really difficult. This is around 2005, 2006. I was also kind of working with different organizations, working with communities in Mumbai, and just understanding how they could work together among themselves to self-solve local problems instead of sort of waiting for the government or the municipality to solve it for them. And at that time, I didn't really know that that would be called research, right? So I was like, I'm kind of facilitating. And by a very strange coincidence, I moved to Bangalore in 2006, and an organization called CKS at that time reached out to me, and they said, well, you seem to have all the attributes of a researcher. Would you be interested? And I was like, okay, sure. I mean, of course, I had an MPhil at that point, so I knew sort of the crux of research. And I was like, what kind of research is this? And they're like, ethnographic research. And I was like, furiously typing on Google, what is ethnographic research? Because I did not know that. And that kind of started my journey, where I am very much a self-taught researcher. So I've spent hours basically just gleaning things from the internet, doing things, making mistakes, and still figuring it out. And my career has kind of gone between leading large teams, then doing a lot of freelance individual work, then again coming back to sort of senior individual contributor roles in Google around 2013, and then again managing large teams. So I feel like I kind of go through that both inside perspective and outside, the both sort of the IC versus like the management. So it's been a great journey. And I think my passion for UX basically comes more from the perspective of how do you solve a problem with the right tools and with the right approaches, rather than sort of like a more, I would say, like, focused attention on like all the nuances of research. So sometimes I'm sure there are more qualified people than me who would like have all the intricacies of research well nailed down. But I think what I bring to the table is this approach towards creative problem solving.
Great. So these days you're at WhatsApp. One thing I have to mention is, to thank you on behalf of the Israeli people. I am Israeli for WhatsApp. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Israelis use WhatsApp, extensively. To us, it's very strange that my American friends and colleagues here still use iMessage or some other strange platforms. By the way, people, WhatsApp is far superior to those things. I don't know what you're doing with your text messages. Yes, I'm surprised I even have time to talk to you, because I'm part of like 20 million WhatsApp groups, and I really have to get back to everyone. So, it's a good thing I was able to find some time.
Yeah,
so thank you for what you do.
Yeah, and like, of course, it's my pleasure. It's like, just as what you said about Israel, I would say the same about my country, India, where everyone's on it. I'm probably not in as many groups as you are, because I tend to mute a lot of those groups. And then, but it's a great product. I think it's kind of unified the world in a very interesting way. So that's one of the reasons why I was very keen on joining the team and kind of help take it to what it could go to in the next few years.
Yeah, for sure. And, with WhatsApp groups, I think it's mostly kind of, there's a very big FOMO for me. I am part of groups that I really have very little interest in, but just, not being in them seems like a difficult decision to make. Anyway, it's a wonderful platform and continued success. So let's jump into research democratization. And, you mentioned being a creative problem solver and focusing on problems. The first thing I really wondered, and I haven't really looked into it deeply myself, is when did this conversation over research democratization even start? And what problem do you think, in your opinion, was it meant to solve in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, if I really think hard about it, I think this process of democratization has been going in parallel with the democratization of technology, right? So at one point, if we think about like, yes, the 1960s, 70s, we had very academic like researchers who would spend an incredible amount of time on the field, would do very, very rich ethnography, come back with those insights, and then think about what could we do, how could we preserve that culture, and so on. But if we kind of fast forward to the 90s, you start seeing that as the internet was becoming more popular, more and more people were paying attention to the user experience. And yes, of course, at that time, our user experience was very far from kind of being where it is today. So in some ways, there was already some process of democratization happening at that time, right? But where I think this huge shift has happened is perhaps like in my mind, in the last sort of 5 to 7 years, where we are kind of really like shipping product on product, apps on apps, websites on websites. We've got like everything templatized, ready to go, anyone to use. And in this scenario, while this is fantastic because that many more people can now have access to the technology, I think on one hand, it's kind of driven the need for research and design. So you can see organizations have hundreds, if not thousands of them on the team. So the size of the UX team started growing continuously. But if I kind of take a step back at where we are currently, part of me wonders, whether this trajectory that we've been on is actually sustainable and whether this is actually good for our discipline in the long run. And that's where a lot of my thoughts on the undemocratizing of research comes from. So it's a lot more about, well, how do we sort of take a little bit more control back of what we do in the name of research in the face of design systems, UX becoming a lot more mature, and kind of, again, go back to the idea of, hey, can you actually think a little bit more about what we are building systematically in a cross-functional group so that you are not kind of using research a little bit like as a support to constantly validate your sort of random average ideas, right? So research in many ways for me is it really should be sort of path forward, building the sort of vision for the next couple of years. So I would say the velocity of this democratization has definitely increased in the last 5 to 7 years.
And so what I'm hearing, I guess, is that you believe what's driving that, among other things, is a lot of the kind of tactical testing of, in your words, kind of these kind of rather mediocre, or somewhat random ideas that come up at an incredible pace. Is that accurate?
For sure. And not that all the ideas are mediocre. It's just the volume of it, right? Just the volume of it is so high that at some point you'll be like, well, I forget to really understand which of these are really great ideas versus some of them are just average and probably have been discussed n number of times, because we are we are going for quantity rather than keeping on top of the quality.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask you, are you aware of this happening in the context of any profession? One thing I think a lot about is that, I've definitely heard a lot of discussion around the democratization of research and now also the undemocratization of research. I don't think I've really heard that in the context of any other profession. And I wonder why. What do you think it is about research that even brings this up as a hypothetical avenue to take?
I do think this trend exists in other disciplines. So if I think about design in particular, I think I would not be surprised if a lot of my fellow UX people thought that, hey, we are also actually designing things at a rapid speed and just churning stuff out. And we know that, yes, these would most likely work, or if we have some hesitation, let's work with research. So I think the volume is increasing pretty much, I would think, both for design as well as if I think about data science. I'm the type of experiments we run, the type of designs we put out there, for having worked in some of these organizations, I would think they are going through something similar. Now, the difference, however, is that some of these functions may think of embracing it a lot more because, hey, if we could all run experiments on different parts of the experience, that could be a great thing because that could then lead to massive, quick, rapid product change. But I think as researchers, because we are a little bit more self-reflexive on how we do things and how do we evolve the craft, that it does kind of strike us a bit more. I mean, I'm not saying everyone would share my opinion, but I think it probably strikes a note somewhere, which is hey, are we just kind of doing too much of the same and not enough on the sort of the forward-looking, quality, strategic pieces? So I think it's a shared space. There probably are different degrees of sort of, concern or lack of concern, in these disciplines. But I do think research is at the forefront of it.
And there's also still a difference, right? So maybe I can ask this in a different way. I feel like, and you mentioned this in the article, part of democratization is when a non-researcher, in this case, takes on a research role.
Yes.
And I think that's what I meant when I talk about not really seeing this in other contexts. I haven't seen many cases of non-designers taking on a design role, non-data scientists taking on a data science role, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe at Facebook, for example, I do have lots of friends who work for Facebook and companies within Facebook. If we take quantitative researchers, for example, quantitative UX researchers, a lot of their work touches upon what others may consider already like data science. But again, I don't see that as being common, and I don't see many discussions within the broader design community about, democratizing design and enabling non-designers to design. So that's interesting to me. Would you agree with that?
Yes, to a great extent. I would agree with that. I think it's coming because the tools of design have also gotten better in the last couple of years. So I think one of the biggest, perhaps, change factor, if I think about the design space, is just like the improved tools like Figma, right? So if I talk about my experience, I can tomorrow try and really mock up a few screens if I wanted to, because on one hand, I have a tool like Figma. I have the components already designed by the design expert. So all I would have to do is kind of drag and drop it and just be able to understand what is the design language that a Facebook or an Uber uses, right? So I don't think that it's not there. I think it's more like, one, are we talking about it? And two is like, is this just coming with a bit of a time delay when, the conversations actually start warming up on this space?
Yeah, for sure. And well, first of all, thank you, people at Figma, if you're watching this. Amazing. We appreciate you.
Just sold you there. Yeah.
And it will be interesting if in a year or 2 or 5 we see a design leader talking about undemocratizing design. I'd be very curious to see that. So I love that that direction. I didn't think about it as much. So yeah, that makes sense to me. It does sound like from your article, correct me if I'm wrong, that in the past you did try some of these approaches. You did try to democratize research, right? What led you to do that in the first place? Like when you look back now, what problem were you trying to solve?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so a lot of the techniques which Eduardo mentioned in his article are the things that we tried in our team. So I was like the research lead who actually agreed to do this at Uber in the first place. And the reason why we decided to do it is like, I think Behzod talked about it as well in his talk, which is, if you look at how global some of our products are, you are never really going to have a researcher who's who's on every aspect of the experience for every possible market in the world. So just due to the global nature of these organizations and the products we are putting out there, the researchers will always be fewer than the parts of the experiences we should be touching and improving, right? So this came from very much that same context, which is like at that time at Uber, we had things that we needed to fix in Asia and Latin America and Europe. So we are like, well, we clearly can't do it all. So we do need some people who are on the ground, who have the sensibility towards research to actually support some of our efforts as well. What we could do was we could kind of walk them through those tools of the trade that we would use, kind of really create those playbooks so they knew what to do step by step. So we did try a lot of that, and some of it was successful. So it's not like none of it was successful. Some of it very much was successful. But what we started realizing over time as we were doing this is two things would happen. One is people would assume that research basically just means walking up to another person and just kind of talking to them. So pretty much all of us could do that potentially if we really wanted to. And then two is, because this was feasible, then you would have like other parts of the business, so whether it's marketing or like product management, who would be like, oh, well, the researcher is really busy, so can I just use someone on the ground to just do this, right? And yes, at a logistical level, it's fine, someone could do it, but then it really puts the pressure back on the researcher who is looking at this problem space to be like, well, have we answered any real questions here other than kind of get maybe like quick validation of, yes, do you understand what you are seeing? Like, is this color, is this tone, is this language clear to you? So yes, we would get tons of great validation of that. But did that necessarily make a part of that domain more like, more knowledgeable? And I think that's where we started seeing the problem, which is like, whether we were trying to understand what would be an ideal driver experience, or whether we are trying to understand sort of group dynamics and so on, when you open that channel up, you will get a lot of feedback, and some of them are good, but the researcher then really has to think that much more in terms of, are all these insights relevant? Are all these insights moving the product narrative forward? Or is it just like, at this point in time, I have a validation? And how will I bring all of this together to kind of create a central narrative around the direction we need to go as a team? So just like the quality and the quantity started to kind of hit against each other at some point.
Yeah. And I'll just say, by the way, thank you everyone for commenting so far, Tiana and Vishal and others. We see your comments, and we'll be answering some of your questions later on. So I know this is to your point, this is kind of a big question to ask, but you have rich experience in the field, and so I would like for you to articulate, what does it take to generate incredible insights, right? You're mentioning how you realized at some point you're not meaningfully building up these domains of knowledge. Just something is broken there. And so I'm sure that everyone watching this either now or later would love to hear about your perspective on, well, what does it take to generate incredible insights, or what are the things you need to develop as a researcher that go beyond just, I'm asking questions, I'm talking to someone, therefore I'm doing research. And again, I know this is one of the broadest, biggest questions we can ask in our field, but maybe you have some broad ideas on this.
I mean, as you said, right, like there's going to be a huge amount of answers to that, but I'll take a stab at it. I think the first thing you really, really need to kind of think about when you are trying to get to those strategic answers is, have we looked at the problem from various different parts of the business and their perspective? So it's not just enough to say, hey, I talked to X number of people and this is what they said, and hence this is the future direction, right? Because that's a sample of 15, 25, whatever you choose. But then there's also, at the backside of it, there's a huge data science team which could be like working with you and looking at, is this the hypothesis that you are proposing? Does that stand out in the data? Similarly, you might be proposing some kind of a direction, for the product, but does the engineering team have that like feasibility? Like, can they actually build this? So just like, I mean, an insight for me, like a great insight which moves a business, is really about harnessing the perspective of all of these people. But it stems from some interesting user behaviors. So it's not so much the opinion of like, this is what people said, but it's also like the things that they leave unsaid, where you are really focusing on observation, right? Like you are spending time, you are spending cycles in a given space with a certain group of people to not just finish at like 45 minutes or 60 minutes, but you are like, I am regularly part of that ecosystem where I'm seeing how people are evolving. And only after you've kind of spent a certain amount of time that you realize, okay, this is likely to be a big opportunity. So for me, it's about that cross-functional collaboration and getting people's brains to solve a problem. But secondly, it's also about just being in a space for long enough to be able to understand the space and its dynamics in a significant amount of nuance. So if you're going to kind of continuously move from one project to another, then I'm like, yeah, sure, what you will achieve is like you will achieve an understanding of how the screens work, but you may still not achieve what's like the actual real motivation of people for them to go through the screens, because some of that motivation will come from who they are outside of the interview with you. It'll come out when they don't know that there's research happening, but they kind of go back and reflect on it. So I think it's a matter of like time as well, which is, are we looking at a problem space with enough depth, with enough time? And you could do many projects. So I don't think the issue is like, hey, let me take a year to go figure this out. But the issue is like, can you kind of try to explore different parts of the same problem in a more agile fashion, but then also take the time to put those pieces of a puzzle together to say, so this is the big picture I am going for, right? And that takes time. So that definitely takes time. That takes regular revisit. That takes some amount of self-reflection, which is like, how do I think my narrative is shaping up? And also takes tremendous amount of feedback from other people in the business to say, do we think we are going down the right path? So I think all of those factors come in to make what is like a sort of a game-changing insight.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate that refocusing on collaboration rather than democratization, which is one way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Great. Let's maybe take a couple of questions at this point, and then I'd love to explore a couple of other things. So first of all, I don't know how many episodes of this you've watched, Saswati, but every single episode, Tiana X asks a question. And I thank you very much, Tiana X, for engaging with my random YouTube shenanigans. I really appreciate it. And, people who are so engaged in the community and what's going on are sure to be successful and contribute a lot back to the community. So I really appreciate it. Today, Tiana is asking about how she gets a lot of questions about how UX research impacts product decisions, and that many people wonder or they fear that UX research could delay or negatively impact launch decisions, that it gets in the way. And maybe that's part of why, part of the research democratization approach. It's like, maybe we can scale more, do more, and therefore we won't negatively impact, launch decisions. What's your take on that as a research leader?
I have heard that for the
I can feel your pain.
So this is no mystery. This is no surprise whatsoever. This is definitely one part of the UX research narrative today, which is, yes, if like a researcher could potentially delay the product rollout. And that's where, like, I think I mentioned this in my article, which is like, I think the discipline now has two key goals ahead of us. One is, how do we keep up with the speed of product development? And the other is, how do we still be a thought leader and shape the future possibilities of a product, right? And these two things are almost kind of polemic in nature. They are diametrically opposite. In one, you are going for speed, the other, you are going for depth. And my sense is that I think somewhere down the way, we will have to kind of have researchers specialize a little bit more on one or the other. Because if we are expecting the same researcher to do both, they will probably not be doing any of it really well. So yes, as we enter the discipline, I did this myself. which is when I started as a researcher, I did a lot of just like, testing, right? Like there were other senior researchers who were thinking about the big picture. They would work with design. We will have some ideas. We will take that, rapidly iterate, rapidly get feedback. But as I've kind of grown through my career, I'm like, yes, I hear the need for that, but we just need to sort of balance the two. And for a single person to do it, it's quite a tough one. It's really a tough one. So I would encourage a lot of people to really get that solid basis in testing, iteration, rapidly changing designs upfront in their career. And secondly, I am a big fan of unmoderated tools as well. So I'm like, look, if it's a low risk question and you are asking me this because you have some doubts, then let's try these tools, because they then increase the efficiency of a researcher that much more. And I am super open to, like, the designers or the product managers giving it a shot. Like, I'm like, yes, I mean, it's as much your product as it is mine. So if you really care about it, feel free to do it. But where I would have a problem is like if this is all we did. Like I would be like, but that would not really help you get ready for the future of your business. So to some extent, I would encourage the researchers to kind of hold the ground, right? Which is to have a very open conversation, especially as an IC, which is like, how much of my time should I be doing on this kind of very quick, rapid, iterative work versus I need to dedicate that just a brain space to think about what is the real problem we are trying to solve. It's a hard line to hold. Like, I mean, by no means, like, was it easy in my career? Because I would always get the feedback, like, which is like, oh, but, you're trying to think of the big problem too fast whereas like we need this now. But I think we as researchers have to hold that line and have to have that conversation very clearly, which is like, this is what I believe from the oversight that I have, that what is good for the team. And let's talk about why we wouldn't be able to do that, right? Like what are the business sort of limitations, business challenges, which would prevent us from doing that? Because if in my experience, most of our cross-functional partners would probably agree with us that yes, the real value of research is in that long term, and yet the short-term pressures just constantly keep taking that time away. So hard one, but I do encourage people to flex that muscle, which is have that conversation, set a certain percentage of time for each of these. And then if you can, like, look at the skills of the people in your team and think about, is one person more suited to kind of focus on this quick iteration? Because there's a ton of people who enjoy that as well. And then there are others who are willing to spend a bit more time, a bit more of their energy in kind of just breaking down a larger space over time.
Absolutely. And I can tell you one thing, I have a video in production right now, and I'm not sure how contrarian this is, but I absolutely agree with you that I do not believe in generalism, in the generalist researcher. And I'm saying this as someone who has always been hired as a generalist. I have not worked for the Facebooks and Googles of the world where we separate, for example, between qualitative and quantitative research. And you're talking about another dimension of tactical, iterative versus longer-term research. But I share that view with you that it's not a good approach to try and be a generalist, or to encourage people in your team to be generalists. Great. Another question we got from Vivian L. Thank you for your question. Let's bring it up here. How do you see international research without having researchers in those locales in important markets? I'll just say for the record that the company I currently work for, Wealthfront, we only operate in the US. So these days, although I've worked for international companies in the past, this is not my expertise these days. What's your approach on international research, and how does that intersect with this notion of democratizing research?
Yeah, so I've spent quite a bit of my career on international research, and I think that way of work, one, is like rapidly changing because of COVID-19. But overall, I think what has worked is a couple of things, right? Like one is if you really care about those markets, you just have to invest in the people there. Like there's no way that you can always continuously fly people in. I mean, you can have great research agencies that if you trust and they do deliver well, that's one way. And then two is the other way, which we've been kind of exploring, which is like, hey, are there people on the ground who sit in those offices, who take an interest in research, who we could train up, right? Because then they understand the product really well. They understand the local culture very well. So that solves the problem to some extent. But I think nothing really beats the fact that having more of that international perspective, having a researcher on the ground, just gets you that much more of a better response, that much of a better sort of insight. I know that there's there's a lot of issues about having singular people in satellite offices and so on. So yes, that definitely makes it challenging for a research lead, a manager, but there's no substitution to that. And in this current moment in time, the way we are doing this is we just have to rely on great partners. So people who have a lot of sort of pre-established knowledge of those markets, where while we may not be able to travel, they are still able to bring the users to some extent onto a platform like this, where we can still have the conversation face to face, but we are definitely missing some of the rich sort of data around their lifestyle, what they would do if they were sort of moving around and so on. So I think it'll be going forward, it will be a balance between building those skill sets on the ground as well as some degree of remote work, so that we kind of operate in this new normal a little bit more efficiently.
Yeah. And we have another question. It's kind of a follow-up from Christopher. Thank you, Christopher. Asking about the transition from speed-focused research to depth-focused research. I'm not sure it's a transition per se. So both exists. I mean, I can share that one thing we're thinking about right now at Wealthfront, which I've thought about in previous companies as well, is all of our process around road mapping and planning research, and how we can insert both of those types of research into roadmaps and make sure that those plans enable us to focus on both. And this ties with other things like, what's the cadence of research and how in line is it with the product teams versus kind of separated from it. But maybe you can share another challenge or two that you've been able to tackle when it comes to getting both of these types of research done well.
Yeah, I mean, Christopher, there's no 100% shift. I think we still do both. I think, as Noam said, part of this is just kind of building that agreement with stakeholders, right? Which is if we want to do the job that we are best positioned to do, then we need to have certain flexibilities as a discipline. And that flexibility comes with deep empathy for the rest of our team. So it's not we are just going to be there and be I need X percentage of my time. So a lot of the time, I think what we end up doing is really looking at the roadmap and really kind of revisiting it at regular cadence, because sometimes the demand will spike on the business side and you'll be okay, this was the time I had dedicated to do some more foundational work, but I need to slide it out. So a big part of my thought on this is to gain the trust of your team and to really kind of demonstrate the value of what have you achieved when you've done some very effective foundational work. What did that let the team do over a certain amount of time versus when you've kind of done a lot of just very tactical research, and kind of getting the team to reflect on that and come to a solution together, which is what does the business need at this point in time? Because it is, after all, this is very much a result of what the business needs. So, I can't take that decision in my own isolated way. I don't think anyone can. So a lot of this discussion about like undemocratizing research comes from a point of where is the business that you all work in and that I work in their growth cycle. I mean, are they still at that very sort of early stage where they just need to ship, or are they somewhere in the middle where, yes, of course, there is a pressure to ship, but they also have to invest in the future? And then there are others who are like, we already have a mature product out there, so really help us identify what that big thing is, right? So spending a lot of time understanding the business need, I think, is a big one to kind of achieve this balance.
For sure. I wanted to ask you, another growing subfield within our field is research ops. Research ops has become huge, and I wonder if you feel like there are interactions and there's a relationship between research ops and how strong it is within the organization, and this notion of democratizing research, or even the necessity for it in the first place. Is there a relationship between those things in your mind?
I think there is, and it will only increase, which is like, I know like a lot of folks would say that, look, something like these trainings, right, like that you kind of help onboard people with, if these trainings were created once and then you could hand it off to an ops person who would just run it for you at a regular cadence, that in itself is a massive help, right? Because a lot of times, like, the expectation is that it is the researcher's job also to train everyone else. And I don't think it has to be. I think it can go a lot to the operations folks, because we've kind of said, like, these are the steps, right? So if you can kind of follow through, that would be great. And then the other area, which I kind of look at my research operations team very significantly for, is to continuously sort of look at the market for tools, which is like a lot of this challenge around democratization. It's not really going to be solved by more humans. I think it has to be solved by better tools. So what is out there today which allows us to get to better answers with sort of lesser human involvement? So I kind of look at those two things, as well as to some extent that planning and prioritization, right? Because sometimes I do feel like researchers, like, when you ask them to continuously revisit their project planning, it's like, oh, but this is kind of tedious. So if we can get more support on that project management, the tools discovery, and once something has been built in the operationalizing of it, that would take us very far.
Yeah. We have a quick comment from Kilin, who is asking about the Handbook of Global Research by Hofstetter, and whether we've read it or anyone else has read it. I don't think I have.
I have.
You? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're much more of a global researcher than I am. That's for sure. Any thoughts on that book in general?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Hofstede has talked about, right? Like in terms of the dynamics of like social connection, like how independent are users, or like individuals in different sort of cultures. To some extent, they do remain true. Like whether you talk about individualistic or collectivistic cultures, I think they still remain true. But what I think is changing perhaps is, and again, like, it's changing very slowly. So, culture is pretty deep-seated. So I think what is changing a little bit more is just how much do we think the perspective of one culture building product for another culture is relevant. So this is where, like, I think the last decade has worked relatively well for a lot of American companies to build some amazing global products. But something is still missing, which is just basically connected to the very core day-to-day needs of users in these markets, which Hofstede is like a little bit further removed from. He's looking at cultures as a whole, and suddenly we are seeing these micro behaviors which are popping up in different countries, which you really have to kind of be very close to understand and build for. And that's again why, like, some of these questions about, hey, do we have people on the ground who can do this faster, who can keep a pulse on this, really come up. So I think we will see much more of that going forward.
Yeah. I have one more question for you, and then we'll end there because time flies when you're having fun. I know so I mentioned earlier, this notion of generalism. I know that I'm going to attack that next. And I have to ask you, are there any other kind of approaches to research that you feel are leading us astray? What's going to be your next article potentially when you get to it? Because I'm sure you're a busy person. But besides democratization, what else is on your radar right now?
Yeah, so I don't know how well this is going to sit with people, but I think one of the things that I'm kind of grappling with right now is how the research community is kind of being very cautious about expressing its opinions about how product development as a whole is happening around the world. And yes, we are all great collaborators and partners, but I think, I can't be the only one like who has contrarian views. So I'm like, there must be more of us, and I'd like to see much more of those, because that's when you start having meaningful discussions. Because if we all said, yes, we all agree with everything, then that doesn't move the discipline forward. So that is top of mind for me, which is, are we as a group of professionals who share a space of work being true to ourselves and really calling the hard conversations out? I think we are lacking, or we are still maybe like, we've kind of gone a little bit softer than maybe like the 80s, 90s, where there used to be very heated debates about what great design is and so on in the last couple of years. And I'd love to see that come back.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. So before we end, I've added, the details that you wanted to into the description of this YouTube. So if anyone wants to reach you, those details are in the description in addition to mine. But is there anything else you wanted to share or mention before we end?
Well, only like, thank you for having me. I hope the folks who kind of heard us online found it useful. And if any of you have follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat. And lastly, like, there's no magic bullet here, right? Like, a lot of this process is just like, we've got to put in the work, gain the trust, and then kind of operate from a position of criticality about how we work. So take heart if people don't listen to you in the first go. Try again and just persevere, because I think I have come to this articulation almost after 5-7 years of seeing this happen. So we have a lot of opportunity to just like think about these things, say these things, and not get discouraged if it doesn't happen overnight.
Absolutely. Saswati, thank you so much for joining me today. It was an absolute pleasure, and I'm very grateful for it. I'm grateful that I was able to end season 1 of this vodcast, or whatever we call it, with a conversation like this. To everyone watching, thank you for watching this conversation and any others if you have. To be clear, there are many more things to come. So besides season 2, which I will be getting to later in the summer, I've been recording a bunch of shorter form recorded and edited videos, which I will start to share next week. Many thoughts and many things, slightly different formats. So I hope you join me for that as well, and you can watch all of that on the YouTube. And then if you need to get in touch for anything, then I'm right there, and I would love to hear from you. What else can be said for now? Goodbye. Have a good weekend. I hope wherever you are, whether it's across the pond in London, like Saswati, or around here in the US. And see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.